So much of our lives are defined by turning points, either fleeting or extended moments where life as you know it is forever transformed. It could be somebody that you met, a travel experience, even a loss. The list is endless. Well, the proverbial fork in the road for Robert Douglas-Fairhurst was being diagnosed with a still relatively unpredictable and misunderstood illness. A writer and literature professor, it's only fitting then that stories played a huge role in helping him make sense of that diagnosis. He recounts the journey in his new book, Metamorphosis, A Life in Pieces. Robert Douglas-Fairhurst, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
So your story in Metamorphosis starts at an appointment with a neurologist in 2017, what you describe as your trap door. Can you walk us through that?
Yes, although walking you through it also involves you showing how I plummet, because it was a moment that I was both partly expecting, because of course we all disaster Google when we have symptoms, and I realized that I could be suffering from a neurological disorder. But when the neurologist said multiple sclerosis, it was as if the trapdoor had opened and I'd fallen through it. A bit like, and this is the first literary analogy you're going to get, a bit like Alice when she falls through into a wonderland and meets a character called the caterpillar who says to her, "Who are you?" And she's not quite sure. And at that moment, when I was diagnosed, I thought to myself, "Who are you?" And I couldn't answer it.
You also talk about. I wanted to ask if this came as a surprise. You kind of answered that there. You talk about how it changed your relations with your family members, your partner, and even your students. What was that process like?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to work in an Oxford college where we are both colleagues and collaborators, but also it's more like a kind of large family unit. And so my students and my colleagues were like an extension of my family in the sense that they were supportive but not intrusive. They wanted the best for me but didn't want to interfere. And that's carried on to this day. I think I've been very fortunate. The same is not true of many other people whose marriages end up fracturing and flaking apart, just as their body is fracturing and flaking apart. And I wasn't like that because I had a partner who I call M in the book, who realized that what I needed was not sympathy. What I needed was laughter. And his job was to act as a sort of clown, to laugh me through what was going on.
I want to turn to the literature now, of course. As a professor of literature, the title of your book obviously has meaning. What is the link between your story and Kafka's novella, The Metamorphosis?
So Kafka's novella was first published in 1915, and if listeners don't know it, it's about a traveling salesman called Gregor Samsa who wakes up one morning transformed into a giant insect. And his family is not as supportive as mine was. His family are confused and angry and end up abandoning him, and he dies and he's thrown out with the rubbish. I suppose the reason I wanted to choose that as my title is partly because, as I said earlier, any kind of life-changing diagnosis can feel as if your whole existence has been kind of transformed. But also it's a word that begins with M and ends in S, metamorphosis. So I suppose it was also a nod to that particular kind of transformation that multiple sclerosis brings you.
You say in your book that we all tend to understand our lives through stories, but I think with the advent of social media and other kind of more instantly gratifying distractions, that's less and less the case. How did you personally come to see literature as so important to understanding yourself, your diagnosis, and the world that we live in more generally?
Yeah, I think social media and reading a novel, it's not that different. Whether you're writing a blog or you're tweeting, or I suppose if you're going to confession, they all have the same impulse, which is that we are storytelling creatures. We make sense out of life by making sentences out of it. And that's especially important at moments of stress or crisis, because when you are falling apart, what reading allows you to do is to piece things back together again. Ian Forster has this lovely line in his book, Aspects of the Novel, where he says, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" And I suppose my own reading show the importance of that, because when I wasn't quite sure what was going on in my body or inside my head, writing down fragments of memory, literary quotations, and reading other people's books, then I suppose helped me to find out.
What are some of the other works that you've found comfort in throughout your journey?
Well, I mean, in my book, I go over quite a wide range. I talk about my own childhood reading involving superhero comics. I talk about writers like Dickens, who also transformed himself when he stopped being a shorthand reporter and reinvented himself as a novelist. I talk about Lewis Carroll, who wrote about Alice and the endless transformations that she goes through when she's dreaming, but also writers like Beckett in plays like Happy Days, where Winnie finds herself buried up to her neck in a mound of earth and tries to keep herself going by remaining cheerful. And that became, I suppose, another kind of model for myself as my body gradually started to shut down.
As a final question for you, Robert Douglas-Fairhurst, you talk about the kind of evolution of your taste in reading from Marvel superheroes on to the more classics like Charles Dickens and Virginia Woolf. I'm curious to know, as a literature professor, do you see all books as equal in terms of their ability to transform people's lives and experiences?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I do when I'm lecturing at Oxford is draw on examples which might range from Shakespeare to Donald Trump's tweets, because they are all examples of how writing can help us to make sense of the world around us, a bit like a lens you hold up so that you can see it more clearly, more sharply. And so I don't see any distinction between so-called high literature and other kinds of writing.
Robert Douglas-Fairhurst, author of Metamorphosis, A Life in Pieces, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's all for me for today. Thank you very much for joining us here on Live from Paris. Do stay tuned to France 24. More news and analysis continues with my colleagues shortly.